Pizza is the most eaten food on the planet. Cheap, familiar, ordered without a second thought in almost every country on Earth. But for nearly 200 years, the single ingredient that makes pizza what it is, the tomato, was believed across Europe to be a deadly poison. For nearly 2 centuries, wealthy Europeans refused to touch it. It was the poor, with far less to lose, who finally dared to put it on their bread. This forbidden fruit went on to survive a royal feast, get scorned as filthy gutter food for generations, cross an ocean in the pockets of immigrants, and get carried home by soldiers after a world war. So how did a feared poison become the most popular food on the planet? This is the history of pizza. Long before Italy existed as a nation, ancient civilizations were already baking flatbreads topped with oil, herbs, and cheese. The Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Persians all had their own versions. What none of these ancient flatbreads had was the one ingredient that would eventually define pizza, because the tomato didn't even exist outside the Americas yet. It wouldn't reach Europe for another 1,500 years. When Spanish explorers finally brought the tomato back to Europe in the 1500s, it wasn't celebrated, but that's not the strangest part, because the tomato belongs to the nightshade family, the same family as deadly nightshade itself. Many Europeans assumed it had to be just as poisonous. And the word pizza itself is almost as old as the flatbread tradition it describes. The earliest known record of it appears in a Latin document from the year 997, written in the small town of Gaeta, north of Naples blank, where a local tenant promised his bishop 12 pizzas every Christmas and 12 more every Easter as a form of rent. No one is entirely certain where the word came from. Some historians trace it to the Latin word pincere, meaning to press or to flatten. Others point to the Greek word pita, meaning pie or flatbread. A few argue it comes from an old Germanic word, pizzo, simply meaning a bite. Whatever its true root, one thing is certain. People were writing down the word pizza nearly 500 years before Columbus ever set sail for the Americas. For nearly 200 years after its arrival, the tomato Saturday, mostly untouched by Europe's upper classes, grown only as a curious ornamental plant rather than a food. It was the poor of Naples, laborers with little money and even less to lose, who finally broke the taboo, spreading crushed tomato onto their simple flatbread as a cheap way to make a plain meal more filling. By 1830, this street food had grown so popular that Naples opened what's considered the world's first true pizzeria, Antica Pizzeria Portalba, serving pizza to the working poor who couldn't afford much else. What happened next changed everything. The fear of the tomato didn't stay in Europe. It crossed the Atlantic with early colonists, and in America it hardened into something close to medical superstition. According to a story that has been retold for nearly 2 centuries, a New Jersey farmer and horticulturist named Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson decided to put that fear to the test. On a summer day in 1820, he is said to have climbed the steps of the courthouse in Salem, New Jersey, in front of a gathered crowd and announced that he would eat an entire basket of tomatoes on the spot. A doctor reportedly stood by, half expecting to have to treat him for poisoning. Johnson bit into the first tomato, then another, and kept eating until the basket was empty. He didn't fall ill, he didn't die. Johnson wasn't fighting against nothing. Decades earlier, that same herbalist, John Gerard, had warned that the tomato's chemical made it dangerous to eat. Gerard wasn't entirely wrong. The plant does contain a compound called tumatine, though it exists in such tiny amounts in the ripe red fruit that it poses no real danger at all. The fear had outlived the science behind it by more than 200 years. Historians have since found no solid documentation that the courthouse event happened quite the way it's told. The story wasn't written down until more than a century later, and it may be more folklore than fact. But true or not, it captures something real for ordinary people on both sides of the Atlantic. Eating a tomato once felt less like cooking and more like a dare. In 1889, Queen Margherita of Savoy visited Naples, and according to the most repeated legend, a local pizzaiolo named Raffaele Esposito was asked to prepare something worthy of royalty. He topped one pizza with red tomatoes, white mozzarella, and green basil, the exact colors of the Italian flag. But that's not the strangest part. Historians have since discovered that Naples already had this same red, white, and green pizza, decades before the Queen ever tasted it. The royal story may be more legend than fact. True or not, the legend spread far beyond Naples, and pizza slowly gained a foothold as a symbol of Italian national pride, even as most of Italy outside Naples still barely knew it existed. The Margherita wasn't even Naples' first famous pizza. It wasn't even the only one served that day in 1889. Long before red, white, and green ever touched a pizza, there was a simpler one, Pizza Marinara. The name has nothing to do with seafood, despite what many assume. It's named after the marinari, the wives of Neapolitan sailors and fishermen, who were said to have prepared it for their husbands returning home from the sea. A fast, cheap meal made only with tomato, garlic, oregano, and olive oil, no cheese at all. Some food historians trace mentions of it back as early as the 1700s, decades before Queen Margherita ever set foot in Naples. To this day, Pizza Marinara and Pizza Margherita are considered the only two truly authentic Neapolitan pizzas recognized under Naples' own strict traditional standards. One named for a queen who may never have really asked for it, the other named for the wives of men who simply needed dinner on the table before the next voyage out. For much of the 1800s, pizza wasn't seen as something to be proud of at all. Wealthier Italians, and many visitors from abroad, considered it dirty, greasy street food, fit only for the poorest of the poor. Some foreign visitors described it as barely edible, a food eaten by hand off the street, no different from what livestock might be given. A description almost impossible to imagine for a dish now considered gourmet. This reputation as a lowly, dirty food would follow pizza for decades, and it would travel with it across an entire ocean. The word pizza didn't even appear in an American newspaper until decades after Naples' poorest were already eating it daily. The earliest known mention in the English-language American press came in 1903, in a short item that described it to readers as something close to an Italian kind of scone. Proof that most Americans at the time had no real idea what it even was. Italian immigrants themselves didn't have it much easier. Newspapers of the era regularly ran pieces mocking immigrant food carts and street stalls, describing entire neighborhoods as unsanitary simply because the smell of garlic and tomato drifted from open windows. Health inspectors in some cities went so far as to single out Italian-run food stalls for extra scrutiny, often citing nothing more specific than unfamiliar smells and unfamiliar ingredients. It would take nearly half a century, a world war, and an entire generation of returning soldiers before that same strange-smelling immigrant food became something ordinary Americans would proudly order by name. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, waves of Italian immigrants, many from Naples, arrived in American cities like New York, Boston, and Chicago, bringing their recipes with them. At first, pizza was made almost entirely by Italians. for other Italians, tucked away inside tight-knit immigrant neighborhoods that most Americans never entered. In 1905, Gennaro Lombardi opened what's widely credited as the first licensed pizzeria in the United States on Spring Street in Manhattan's Little Italy. But that's not the strangest part. For years before that, unlicensed street vendors had already been selling homemade pizza slices wrapped in paper to factory workers, completely undocumented and unofficial. Even the building itself had pizza in it before Lombardi's name went above the door. Records suggest a baker named Filippo Milone was already running a pizzeria at that same Spring Street address around 1898, roughly 7 years before Lombardi received his license. Milone went on to open at least 6 more pizzerias around the city before he died in 1924, largely forgotten in an unmarked grave in Queens. A reminder that the first pizzeria title has always been more contested than the plaques on the wall suggest. Lombardi's kitchen, regardless, became something like a training ground for the whole city. One of his employees, a young baker named Antonio Pero, everyone called him Totono, learned the trade there before leaving in 1924 to open his own coal oven pizzeria out in Coney Island, a trolley ride away from Manhattan. Another former Lombardi worker, John Sasso, opened his own shop on Bleecker Street in 1929. A third, Patsy Lanciari, opened a pizzeria in East Harlem in 1933. Almost every old guard pizzeria that New Yorkers still argue about today traces its ovens back to that one storefront on Spring Street, a lineage historians sometimes half-jokingly call a family tree. Pizza remained a mostly regional, immigrant-only food in America for decades, until a war changed everything. American and British soldiers stationed in Italy during World War II tasted real Neapolitan pizza for the first time, and many of them never forgot it. When these soldiers returned home after the war, they brought their cravings with them, and pizzerias began opening across the United States to meet a demand that had never existed before. What happened next changed everything. One of those soldiers came home with more than just a craving. He came home with an idea that would reshape the entire industry. Ira Nevin had worked as an oven repairman before the war, and while stationed near Naples, he studied the wood-fired ovens Neapolitan bakers had used for generations, learning exactly what made them work. Back in New York after the war, he set out to build something new, a gas-powered oven lined with ceramic, designed to recreate that same intense, even heat without needing a skilled pizzaiolo to tend a wood fire all day. He patented his design in 1949 and founded a company called Baker's Pride. For the first time, a shop owner with no formal training could turn out consistent, restaurant-quality pizza. Within a decade, Baker's Pride ovens were humming away in pizzerias from Harlem to Brooklyn, and by the time the first national pizza chains opened their doors in the late 1950s, that same basic gas oven design had already become the industry standard. That single invention, dreamed up by a soldier who'd once fixed ovens for a living, is a major reason pizzerias were able to open on almost every American street corner within a generation. In 1958, Pizza Hut opened its first restaurant in Wichita, Kansas. 2 years later, Domino's followed, and pizza stopped being a neighborhood specialty and became a national industry. Around the same time, a Chicago restaurateur named Ike Sewell introduced a much heavier deep-dish version of pizza, proving that the very identity of the dish could be reinvented entirely, city by city, and still succeed. Within a few decades, pizza had gone from a feared poison to a shameful street food, to a multi-billion-dollar global industry delivered to doorsteps in nearly every country on Earth. In 1957, two brothers, named the Salentanos, working out of New Jersey, invented something that would change how the entire world ate pizza at home: the Fronsin pizza. No pizzeria required, just an oven, a box, and a few minutes. Through the 1970s, the pizza chains went to war with each other, and Domino's changed the rules completely, promising a hot pizza delivered to your door in 30 minutes or it was free. As pizza spread across America, it split into fiercely different regional identities: the foldable thin slice of New York, the thick caramelized square of Detroit, the gourmet toppings of California. By the 1980s, American chains began opening branches overseas, and pizza came back to the world completely transformed. But that's not the strangest part. In Japan, pizzerias began topping pies with mayonnaise and sweet corn, and diners lined up for it. Every country that adopted pizza rewrote it in its own language: green peas in Brazil, paneer and tandoori chicken in India, pickled herring in Sweden. The forbidden fruit of Naples had become a blank canvas for the entire planet. Then, in 2017, Unorth East S formally added the art of Neapolitan pizza making to humanity's intangible cultural heritage list. The same simple flatbread once made by the poorest laborers of Naples, topped with a fruit their ancestors were terrified to eat, was now officially recognized as a treasure of human culture. And yet pizza still starts arguments. Since the 1960s, one topping alone, pineapple, has divided the entire world into two furious camps, proof that centuries later, people still can't agree on what belongs on a flatbread. By the 21st century, pizza had completed an extraordinary circle. Chefs in Naples and far beyond it were once again treating it as a refined art form, served in Michelin-starred restaurants at prices no 19th century laborer could ever have imagined. Today, pizza sits in nearly every home on Earth. Its poisonous reputation, its years of being scorned as filthy street food, almost entirely forgotten. So the next time you order a pizza without a second thought, remember, this dish was built from a fruit an entire continent once feared as poison, survived being called filthy gutter food for generations, and was carried home from a war, before it ever became the most ordered food on the planet.